Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Luke Hanna. I'm a researcher here at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I will be moderating this webinar today. First off, I would like to thank you all for attending and welcome you to the first webinar in the U.S. Department of Energy Environmental Webinar Series sponsored by Annex 4. The first webinar will focus on the results and outcomes of the instrumentation for monitoring around Marine Renewable Energy Converters Workshop, which was held here in Seattle in June of 2013. These environmental webinars will be held on a quarterly basis and will focus on a variety of different subjects, including research efforts and marine energy project monitoring studies from around the world. The goal of these webinars is really to effectively disseminate new information and research to a wide audience, which includes researchers, project developers, and regulators. The next webinar is scheduled for the late March, early April timeframe. We don't have an exact date quite yet, so stay tuned for that. Today you will be hearing from three speakers. The first speaker will be Jocelyn Braun-Saracino. Jocelyn is a senior analyst for New West Technologies, a contractor supporting the U.S. Department of Energy Wind and Water Power Program. She helps manage the environmental portfolio of the Wind and Water Power Technologies Office and is involved in both MHK and offshore wind projects. Jocelyn will provide a brief overview of the DOE Water Power Program and will be bringing you all up to speed on Annex 4, including the goals and outcomes of the first phase, which ended this last year, as well as what is in store for the second phase of the project, which began this year and will continue into 2016. The next two speakers, Andrea Copping and Brian Pelagi, will be providing an overview of the experts workshop. Dr. Copping is a research lead for offshore renewable energy development for the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. She leads a P&L Ocean Energy team, which uses laboratory, field, and modeling measurements to support siting and permitting decisions for wave, tidal, and offshore wind energy. Dr. Copping also leads the international program on collection and analysis of environmental effects information under the OES Annex 4 initiative. Dr. Pelagi is the co-director of the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center and leads marine renewable energy research, development, and testing at University of Washington. As assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, his research areas encompass power generation for marine renewable energy resources, including resource characterization, systems to identify and mitigate environmental impacts, and optimization of energy converter designs. Jocelyn will be taking over next, but just a couple housekeeping issues before we get started. I just sent out a PDF version of the slides and a brief set of instructions on how to sign into the webinar. Hopefully this helps with any of your technical issues. For my future reference, as well as just P&L in general, if you can't see this presentation or are having issues, if you could please just send me a brief email describing that. Hopefully we'll be able to troubleshoot those at a later time. To eliminate any unwanted feedback from microphones, I will be muting all the webinar attendees in a moment. For any questions that you may have, please type them in the webinar chat box. To open the chat box, click the blue and white message icon in the lower left-hand side of the webinar window. And that will open up the chat box so that you can type your questions in there. Our two main speakers, Andrea and Brian, will be using one set of PowerPoint slides, and we'll be switching off several times throughout the entire presentation. So we will hold off on all questions until the very end. As you type in the questions, I'll be gathering all the submitted questions during the webinar, and we'll provide these questions to Andrea and Brian after the presentation. We will try to get through all of the questions, but I apologize in advance if your question is not addressed. And just for your reference, this presentation and audio, a video of the presentation and an audio recording will be posted on the TETHIS website for your future reference. And at the very end, I will provide a link to where you can find this video. So with that, I think we should probably hand it over to Jocelyn.
Thanks so much, Luke. So as Luke mentioned, I'm Jocelyn Braun-Saracino, and I work with the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind and Water Power Technologies Office. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Annex 4 effort, which is sponsoring this webinar series, as Luke mentioned, and also a brief overview of the Wind and Water Power Technologies Office's environmental research portfolio for marine and hydrokinetic technologies. So the Annex 4 initiative is an international environmental data sharing effort, which is a work effort under the Ocean Energy Systems, the OES, which is an initiative under the International Energy Agency. And as Luke mentioned, the first round of Annex 4 recently completed in 2012, and we are now in the second phase of that effort. And the goals of the first phase of this initiative were really to compile information about monitoring and mitigation efforts that were going on around the world about ocean renewable energy technologies, to develop and populate a publicly accessible database with this information, and then finally to make sure that this information was actively disseminated to a variety of end users. And through the course of the effort, there were a number of major products and deliverables, including 2 scientific workshops held in Ireland, a publicly accessible database, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next couple slides, and then finally, a final report, which is available on the TETHIS website, which goes into detail on what research has been done and the current state of understanding around 3 stressor receptor interactions between marine and hydrokinetic devices and the marine environment. So Luke, go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a couple examples of the TETHIS database. The TETHIS database is the database that houses the information that's been gathered historically through the Annex 4 effort and will continue to house information collected in the next phase of the effort. And this is just a screenshot of the knowledge base view of some of the resources that are in the TETHIS database. And Luke, feel free to go on to the next slide, thanks. And then this is a screenshot of the map view. And through the Annex 4 effort, information was gathered on environmental monitoring happening at projects around the world and also environmental research efforts surrounding ocean energy technologies throughout the world. And if those on the phone aren't familiar with the TETHIS database, I would really encourage you to check it out, to become a user, start yourself a user account, and if there's information that you're aware of surrounding environmental research around marine and hydrokinetic technologies that is not currently on TETHIS, we would really love it if you would pass that information along to us. All right, Luke, next slide, please. So we're currently in the second phase of the Annex 4 initiative, and the goals of this phase are really to continue our efforts to gather information on renewable energy, marine renewable energy, environmental research happening throughout the world, to share that information with the international community, and to really try to encourage collaboration and communication amongst the community around issues surrounding environmental effects of the technologies. And Luke, you can go ahead to the next slide. So the major activities that will occur under Annex 4 in the next couple years include the following. We're planning to continue to update and collect what we call metadata forms, which is basically forms that have information or collect information on environmental monitoring and research happening at marine and hydrokinetic projects throughout the world. And I provided the link there if you have some information that you'd like to contribute. We'll be holding a series of workshops. I'm going to be hosting a series of online meetings with the research community to really try to dig into some of the technical questions that we think still need to be further discussed. We are planning to enhance the capabilities of the TETHIS system. So we really want TETHIS to become a commons, and we're for a community to gather and discuss the research and monitoring that's happening around these projects. And we're planning on making some additions to TETHIS, including adding user profiles, providing the ability to rate documents, providing some social media functions, etc. And that will be an ongoing process throughout the life of the Annex 4 effort and throughout the life of the TETHIS database. At the end of this phase of the effort, we are planning to publish what we're terming a State of the Science report, which will outline the current state of understanding regarding the environmental effects of marine and hydrokinetic technologies. We'll be planning an international research conference. The date is yet to be determined, but probably sometime in the 2016 timeframe. And then finally, we're planning to continue this series of webinars. Next slide. So I want to transition to talking just briefly about the Department of Energy's water power program, since the water power program sponsored the instrumentation workshop that you're going to be hearing about. So the water power program sits within the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and it sits further within the Wind and Water Power Technologies Office. And the mission of the water power program is really to perform research and testing and develop innovative technologies that are capable of generating renewable, environmentally responsible. Basically, where the water power program is our mission is to develop innovative technologies that are environmentally responsible and cost effective. And one of the major groups of technologies that we work on are what we term marine and hydrokinetics, and that includes wave, tidal, and ocean current energy, as well as ocean thermal energy and energy from free-flowing rivers. Next slide. And because part of the mission of the water power program is to ensure deployment of marine hydrokinetic technologies and also simultaneously to ensure that that deployment is happening in an environmentally sustainable manner, we have a relatively comprehensive environmental research portfolio. And there are three major arms of that portfolio. The first is to collect data and support experimentation to help identify and quantify what the effects of these technologies are. The second arm of the water power program's environmental research portfolio is really to help ensure that the tools and techniques exist to allow us to answer the environmental questions that we feel still need to be answered. And then finally, the third arm is to share information and to share information and to synthesize information and make sure that it's available for all folks who want to have access to it. And the second arm of this program, monitoring and mitigation technologies and techniques, is really where the instrumentation workshop that you're going to hear about today fits under. And our effort here was really to try to bring together a group of experts to have a conversation about what the current capabilities and limitations around environmental monitoring and instrumentation are for marine and hydrokinetic technologies. And we did this with the understanding that there are challenges to monitoring marine and hydrokinetic technologies given the high energy and often remote environments that these devices are deployed. And Luke, you can go ahead to the next slide. So before I pass the virtual microphone off to Andrea, I just wanted to mention something that I thought might be of interest to those folks on the line, and that's that the U.S. Department of Energy recently published a Notice of Intent, which indicates that we intend to issue a funding opportunity announcement. We have a Notice of Intent that's recently been published, and this is to support marine and hydrokinetic environmental and resource characterization instrumentation. It's anticipated that the FOA will support three topic areas. The first topic area will be the support of marine and hydrokinetic environmental instrumentation development. The second is the development and integration of instrumentation packages. And then the final and third topic area is to support instrumentation surrounding wave resource characterization. And if folks have interest in that, I encourage you to go to this website and to keep an eye out for potential future publishing of that funding opportunity announcement. But I did just want to provide a caveat that the notices of intent from the Department of Energy are always subject to change, and so there's no guarantee that a funding opportunity announcement will actually be issued. But it is our hope and our intent to publish this FOA. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Andrea, and I would like to thank both Andrea and Brian for all of the work that they did in planning the workshop and then doing the lion's share of the work in putting together the workshop report. We were really grateful that they were willing and able to join us in this effort. So Andrea, take it away.
What we're going to do for the next little while, my colleague Brian Pelagi and I are going to talk about the outcome of the experts workshop that we held in Seattle in last June concerning instrumentation needs for monitoring around marine energy converters. What we have found to date is that environmental studies around the small energy projects that we've looked at have been very expensive in relation to the overall project costs, and have generally demonstrated that small projects will have very little significant environmental effects. But this has really made it difficult to extrapolate towards potential effects of larger commercial projects. There's still a lot of uncertainty around it, and we're faced with this really tough dilemma, this paradox, because the way things are going right now, the cost of environmental monitoring could cripple this industry, this sort of emerging wave and tidal industry. But on the other hand, if some of these early projects caused really awful damage, for example, killing an endangered marine mammal, this would also cripple the industry. So there's a real need to move forward. Next, please. Go ahead and fill that slide, please. So as we went into this workshop, we had some expectations of what we would hear. We invited a lot of experts, a lot of scientists and engineers, and we sort of expected to hear a lot of, there's only one way to measure this, and my instrument is the right way to do it. But what we actually heard is that there are many ways to get at measuring the same objective. We also really expected that there would be an outcry for funding to build a lot of bright, new, shiny instruments. But what we actually heard was that some of the greatest challenges is really how to integrate the instruments we have and to develop the software that's needed to interpret the data coming out of those instruments. Okay, in terms of workshop objectives, we first and foremost wanted to really increase our understanding of the state of instrumentation readiness, what instruments are available, what needs to be done to make them more available, to face the really important environmental questions around marine energy, renewable energy development. We wanted to bring together experts to get a consensus on the methods and the ways that these instruments should be used, deployed, operated, and interpreted. And finally, this was an opportunity to provide a forum to bring together many scientists who knew one another, but also to foster future and continuing collaborations, because there's a very strong feeling this is a small emerging industry worldwide, and we really need to all be learning and not reinventing the wheel. Next slide, please. So the scope and organization of the workshop, we were looking at marine energy converters, in this case, which we've shortened to MECs. In this case, we're actually only looking at wave and tidal current converters, not looking at rivers or OTEC or anything else. The environments that we particularly focused on were in the water column and at the air-sea interface. And it's not that other environments, such as the benthic environment, aren't important, but the really tough, vexing questions that haven't been answered easily are in the water column and at the air-sea interface. The intention was this was a worldwide endeavor. The strongest emphasis and examples came from the UK, followed by Canada and the US, but that's simply because of where the greatest number of deployments have been. The workshop was organized into a series of plenary presentations. I think there were 8 or 9 of them, that really tried to sort of set the state of what we know about measuring environmental effects around marine energy converters, monitoring projects, data synthesis, and so on. But the vast majority of the time and the hard work was spent in breakout groups. Okay, next slide, please. Just to give you some idea, this cartoon you're seeing, I hope you're seeing, was drawn by one of my colleagues about 4 or 5 years ago. And this is really how we thought about all the possible interactions between marine animals, habitats, etc., and tidal and wave devices. And there's so many potential interactions. But as you can tell from the big red cross through it, we're really not thinking that way anymore. We've been able to hone down to some very specific interactions that seem to be most significant, most common across projects, and coincidentally the hardest to measure. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, this particular workshop focused on 3 specific types of interactions or environments. The first is the so-called Nearfield. That is quite close to a wave or tidal device, maybe a few device diameters away, tens of meters maybe, and looked at direct interaction of animals with devices, marine mammals, fish, sea turtles, and birds particularly. And the kinds of interactions we had in mind were things like collisions, abrasion perhaps from mooring lines, and strike by turbine blades. The second area we focused on was the distribution and use of habitats by marine animals in these very high energy areas where we might generate wave or tidal power. Now, we know how to measure animals quite well, do stock assessments for many of them under ordinary ocean conditions. But in these very, very high energy areas, it's tough. Most of us don't work in them for a reason. So really being able to understand the instruments and the platforms we had available is important. Thirdly, we focused on measuring the sound produced by wave and tidal devices, not at this stage the effects on animals of that sound, but really how to properly measure that out of sound. The effects work will have to come later. Next slide, please. So the way that we organized these breakout groups where most of the discussion took place is we had 3 of them, Nearfield, distribution and habitat use, and sound. And we divided the scientists up according to their expertise and interest. And they spent time thinking about the instrumentation needs and gaps to measure the interactions important in their particular area. Next slide, please. We then mixed those scientists up into 3 different groups to look at instrument classes and looked at capabilities of those instruments, and again, where there are gaps in not only the instrumentation, but how we'd interpret the data streams, et cetera. And the 3 types of instruments that we looked at are those most commonly used around marine energy devices: active acoustics, passive acoustics, and optical technologies. Next slide, please. We then remixed the groups back to their original 3 blue boxes, if you will, in the Nearfield, distribution, habitat use, and sound. And we asked them to use the knowledge they had gained. This was a 2-day workshop, so after the first day and a half, what knowledge had they gained from the first set of needs and gaps, priorities, the capabilities of the instrumentation, and what were some solutions to meet those various gaps. Okay, next slide, please. This just gives you a quick look at the participants. We had 36 invited participants from 4 different countries attend, and you'll see in the upper left pie graph, the largest majority was from academia, but significant industry and agency presence. On the right-hand pie graph, you see that the vast majority, or almost a majority of those attending self-identified as working in natural resource fields, a smaller number in technologies, but also a very significant number that feel that their work really does cross these boundaries of natural resources and technologies. And this is very much a hallmark of trying to do these measurements in this industry. You can't just be a fish person. You have to understand how to use the instruments to measure the fish as well. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so in terms of what we're going to do now, I'm going to hand it over to Brian in just a moment. The questions we asked the breakout group dealing with the actual instruments, the technologies, were divided into 3 parts. We asked them about the primary challenges to meet the kind of accuracy that the previous groups had said was necessary. They had to look at such things as the cost of operating instruments and capital costs. You can't go with something that's so expensive it'll break the industry. They had to look at power supply requirements, the bandwidth needed for data acquisition, and what kind of processing time and tools, algorithms, could help move that along. They had to look at the challenges of getting the instruments in the water and maintaining them. We know the marine environment is very harsh, and the durability and survivability of what are often designed as research instruments really needs to be considered. Similarly, the platforms and the challenges associated with getting those platforms and moorings and so on deployed are not insignificant in these high energy areas. And finally, what kind of challenges could these instruments present to the marine animals in the region? and associated with the marine animals. For example, in many cases, we're trying to look at vastly different sizes of organisms, speeds of organisms. How do you look at a very small fish and also a whale? Are there certain kinds of limitations seasonally from turbidity of water? We know that optical instruments don't do very well in cloudy water. And finally, what about the safety of operating these instruments from sensitive marine mammals? For example, active acoustics and cetaceans. There can be considerable concern about the kind of signals put out there. So I'm going to hand this over to Brian Pelaggi, and he's going to talk about some of the outcomes of this instrumentation set of breakouts. Brian.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. I'm going to risk another technology glitch and try to take over as presenter here. But I'm going to start and discuss most of the capabilities breakout, so giving you a quick overview of some of the technologies that were considered. And the slide we're starting on now is active acoustics instruments. And just to give you an idea of the sort of instruments that were considered within that group, most of the discussion was around various types of sonars, such as single beam, split beam, multi-beam, and broadband multi-beam sonars, looking at the different trade-offs in terms of cost, complexity, automatic processing. And then we also looked at things like radar and acoustic tags as other classes of active instruments that are separate from sonars. And two example sonars shown there on the right. If we go to the next slide, the outcomes of this discussion were that, in general, direct interactions between a marine animal and a marine energy converter, a MEC, were not easily observable with most active acoustic technologies. The group felt that 2D imaging sonars were promising in this regard, but we were somewhat hampered by the lack of automation of the data processing from these systems. That was a comment that really mirrored what came out of the optical technologies group, that the closer you get to an optical image, the more difficult it is to process. The group also identified needs in terms of data processing and automation. The feeling was that these active acoustic instruments predominantly resulted in relatively high data intensity that was going to require some degree of automated pre- or post-processing, and problematically, this was not necessarily available for several types of instruments, such as acoustic cameras. The group also felt that integrated packages were likely to be necessary, similar to the way that Andrea opened the workshop this discussion talking about how our expectation had been that people would say there is one instrument that can meet this particular monitoring needs. The group generally felt that there were no silver bullets. Each active acoustic instrument had its own strengths and weaknesses and could really be best complemented by combining these instruments and, say, using one instrument to trigger another. And a fourth outcome from this group and all the other groups was that really deployment and survival of instrumentation at marine renewable energy sites is a real challenge. It's difficult to put instruments in the water here, and it was not necessarily a question of the instruments themselves surviving, more the infrastructure required to deploy the instruments and keep them operating, such as cables or platforms. The discussions here predominantly were around hydrophones. These are the most commonly used passive acoustic instrument to measure underwater sound. They're sensitive to acoustic pressure. The group noted that these were extraordinarily susceptible to flow noise at marine renewable energy sites. This is similar to the effect of, blowing on a microphone, or if you're on a bike and you can hear the wind in your ears. It's sound that's picked up by the hydrophone or the recorder, but it's not actually true propagating sound in these environments. And they felt that this was a general challenge with passive acoustic measurements at marine energy sites. There was also some discussion of vector sensors. These are newer instruments that are sensitive to both acoustic pressure and acoustic particle velocity, but they're generally unproven and extremely unproven in marine renewable energy applications. So if we go to the next slide, the outcomes of that group were that the general feeling was that hydrophones work well. They're great tools for measuring sound, both sound from converters as well as sound produced by marine animals. But there's definitely room for improvement in terms of operating them in high energy environments, particularly with respect to flow noise. Similar to the conclusions of the active acoustic group, there was a feeling that integrated packages would likely be both necessary and helpful, and these might allow concurrent monitoring of biological signals, ambient noise, and the sound produced by marine energy converters. There was a general feeling, again, that data processing and automation needed development, that it was certainly possible with passive acoustics to produce relatively high-intensity data streams that would require some degree of automated pre- or post-processing. Next slide. So this is summarizing some of the discussions that went on in the optical technologies group, and this was mostly looking at cameras, either mono or stereo cameras in the visual or IR spectrum, with and without some degree of lighting. And the instruments in this case were relatively straightforward, and the group discussion focused primarily on the platforms that were available to deploy optical technologies around marine energy converters or for studies of distribution and use. And this was actually a rather valuable conversation, even if it wasn't the one we expected that group to have, because it really had relevance to all of the different breakout groups and thinking about not just the capabilities of the technology, but the ability to deploy them. And so the group looked at these different platforms here, remotely operated vehicles where you'd have an ROV tethered back to a surface vessel. Manned submersibles were discussed as one way to get an up-close and personal view of some marine energy converters. There was discussion of surface vessels, basically having observers or cameras on a surface vessel, similarly having a non-propulsed lander or sled that's being moved around by a surface vessel. A lot of discussion of autonomous underwater vehicles, both things, AUVs like, say, the liquid robotics wave glider that I'm showing on the right there, or sea gliders, but also relatively simple AUVs. So things like neutrally buoyant drifters that might support an optical camera as it's basically being swept through a tidal energy site or carried around within a wave energy site. There was discussion of animal-borne critter cams, and critter cams are, I guess, a trade name that's been developed by National Geographic to basically attach cameras directly to marine animals and get an animal's eye view of how they're interacting with the natural environment. The group generally felt that an animal-borne critter cam that had, say, imagery of a marine mammal interacting with a wave converter would be visually striking and incredibly impressive to produce, but incredibly unlikely to actually be able to ever be captured just because of the density of marine animals around these sort of converters. There was also discussion of fixed cabled vantage points, so this would be both fixed and cabled vantage points above the water surface as well as below the water surface, as well as aerial vehicles, including unmanned aerial vehicles such as UAVs and drones for surveys of distribution and use at the water surface. If we go to the next slide, the outcome of that discussion, we basically group things in terms of what are the capabilities of optical technologies for tidal converters, TECs, and wave converters, WECs, both to meet the needs of observations within the near field and to make observations of distribution and habitat use. The general feeling was that while optical technologies had their limitations, there was going to be a role here, but because of the high data and power bandwidth required, that for observations within the near field, the best option would be to integrate these as a cabled platform that's part of the marine converter itself. That seemed to be the best way to get data off the instruments and power to them. When it came to observations of distribution and habitat use, with respect to wave converters, trying to characterize large areas, the feeling was that autonomous vehicles might be a potential game changer here as a platform to deploy optical technologies. But we definitely ran into a bit of a crux here where we were not able to figure out a good press to act against the currents at tidal energy sites. So and again, the general feeling out of the group again density from these instruments, which is going to require some degree of automated pre or post processing. And with that kind of is a neat summary of the different capabilities. The actual report has significantly more detail, but I'll turn this back over to Andrea to discuss the outcome of the needs and gaps groups on near field distribution and use and sound.
Alrighty, I'm going to talk about the gaps and needs, sort of the bullet points that came out of the three focus areas: near field, distribution and habitat use, and sound. And I assume we are on the slide that says near field priorities?
Correct.
So there was a very strong feeling among the group and a huge amount of discussion about the real need to be able to measure every interaction between a marine animal and a marine energy device. We're talking in the near field where things are sort of up close and personal, or at least to really be able to see every interaction, record every interaction for those animals under special protection, for instance, endangered species or highly depleted populations. But the irony here is, if we were to do this, huge amounts of data would be generated and be very difficult to deal with. So this led us very much to what we've hinted at already, and that is the need for integrated packages of instruments, where one might use one instrument, a more a larger field of view instrument to trigger a smaller field of view, more sensitive instrument. An example might be to use passive acoustics to hear an incoming marine mammal towards, say, a tidal energy device, which would then trigger an optical camera to actually see that interaction very close. Secondly, there was a strong feeling, particularly in the near field, that we need to have some transparent and common approaches to risk assessment so we really can determine what those most important interactions are. Because again, going back to the fact that if we try to look at every interaction, or even many of them, we will be so swamped in data, we will not have the opportunity to really see what's important. This leads to this third bullet, which you'll hear over and over again, and that is data processing and automation becomes incredibly vital. We don't have good algorithms to interpret these instrument signals to detect animals or certain classes of animals. And there's a strong need for both pre- and post-processing of data on the instrument and perhaps afterwards to help avoid the so-called data mortgages, these huge amounts of data that really eat projects alive, where the data processing costs far more than the data acquisition. And finally, this whole issue of deployment, maintenance, and survival of instruments at marine energy sites is really challenging. Another common theme you'll hear over and over. Next slide, please. So moving to the distribution and habitat use, the priorities that came out of this group were generally that the group felt we already have the necessary instruments, but that platforms are where advances are really needed. And the two that really stick out there are this need to have autonomous vehicles that have increased endurance, so you can leave them out for longer and they can survive in these high-energy sites. Animal-borne tags, I don't think Brian really touched on this, but tags on animals that transmit and therefore allow you to follow the animals are a wonderful idea, but they are very, very limited in their use. They're expensive, and they tend to be too heavy for most animals. There's only the larger ones that can carry them. So really reducing the weight and cost there could make a very large difference to understand how animals are using these sites. Again, integrated packages, tremendously important, but it won't be one integrated package that all tidal projects should use this and all wave projects should use that. Rather, we need a toolbox approach with a number of different instruments and instrument linkages that will allow us to look at different marine animals and habitats, different technologies, different kinds of questions that are being asked. With that toolbox, there's the opportunity to really tailor for the appropriate question. Again, this issue of data processing and automation, exactly as before, we need better algorithms to detect animals, and we have to pre- and post-process the data. Finally, there was a strong belief in this group that made it this far that the onus of determining population distributions at marine energy sites, that is before there are devices in the water, this really is in the national interest of any nation, and that really has to be borne by government funds. On the other hand, any site-based assessment, right where it's planned to put that tidal or wave farm, really does need to fall on the developers. And I know this is something that probably isn't as much of a surprise to many of the Europeans. This has not been a particularly common understanding in the U.S., certainly. Next slide, please. The sound group, I joked with Brian, who ran this group, that they had the easier way of going about things because they were dealing mostly with physics and not biology. But there are many challenges to measuring underwater sound, and the measurement of sound does very much depend on the technology. They found that drifting hydrophones work best for tidal converters, where they could put hydrophones on a drifter and go past the device along with the tidal current, whereas wave converters sound could be better measuring using fixed hydrophone moored buoys or something similar. Some of the big challenges in measuring sound is really needing to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. These are very noisy sound environments. In tidal converters, as Brian mentioned, it's from the flow noise. Wave converters have to, the sound being measured out of wave converters have to be separated from the background of breaking waves and surf. This is an area that really the participants felt was rife for the development of international standards on how to measure sound from these devices. In the other biological areas, I don't think we're there yet. There is a need for more development of low-cost drifting packages because, again, the interference that one hears, for instance, from a tidal device and tidal sounds are very, very mixed up. There was also some thoughts about how to do some long-term low-cost studies using other kinds of attributes of the machine, such as accelerometers. How is the sound changing over time due to the change in operation of a device? Okay, I am now going to hand this back to Brian, who's really going to start to pull these threads together with some synthesis of common themes throughout this process. Brian.
Thanks, Andrea. So this slide is now synthesis of common themes, and the topic here is risk. And this is really, these next couple of slides are a kind of a synthesis that grew out of some of the discussions that went on inside of each group at the workshop, discussions that the entire group had as part of a closing plenary session, thoughts that we had as the workshop report came together, and then some of the things as we even moved beyond that and started thinking about how to stitch this really all together. And so the way that we think about risk is that often the objective of monitoring is to collect information that allows for a more deformed discussion to take place about environmental risk. And ideally, and I say ideally, over time, the two outcomes would be that significant risks could be recognized and mitigated through converter design or operation. And so that means that potentially not all converters would be suitable to go in all locations if these risks are significant and real. Or if the risks are determined to be insignificant, they could be selectively and responsibly, quote unquote, retired from future monitoring programs. The challenge is that for the topics discussed within the workshop, there's certainly no agreed upon framework for reaching either of these end states with regards to risk. You know, the outcome from conducting an environmental study is in many cases to conduct another environmental study. And one of the real challenges here to making progress is that any decision to retire risk is going to be site-specific and regulatory in nature. It's not going to be an entirely scientific discussion. So really, as scientists, the best thing we can do is to try to provide more information to have that informed discussion. So if we go to the next slide, the challenge here in terms of synthesis is the potential for a data mortgage, because often the highest priority risks are for low probability events. So if we think about risk as being the product of the frequency of an interaction multiplied by its outcome or its end state, oftentimes we're talking about events with a bad outcome that have extremely low probability of occurrence. So to get information about those types of interactions, and I'll say quote unquote fastest way, or the least time, requires deploying monitoring instrumentation that allows you to obtain spatially comprehensive data. So that means you're observing the entire area around a mech and are doing so in a temporally continuous manner. So recording information 24/7. So as many of you have already obviously understood, and as Andrew's already hinted at, the problem is the data bandwidth for this sort of brute force approach is extraordinarily problematic and tends to lead to a data mortgage where you're accruing data at a rate faster than you can hope to process it. We all do this in most studies. You know, there's always some acceptance that we're going to collect data and then we'll process a little bit of it later. But if this gets to a certain point, the curation of those data streams can actually be to the detriment of analysis. And I show an example here for stereo optical monitoring around a converter. So let's say you had 2 stereo optical cameras at 2 megapixels. That's not the highest resolution we could get, but it's a good one for doing species ID. And let's say we're collecting data at 10 frames per second. That's going to be 80 megabytes a second of data a second. Over a 3-month period of observation, which would probably be relatively short for a study, we're talking about 600 terabytes of storage to archive that raw data. And if we have multiple cameras or other instruments in the mix here, we're easily pushing over a petabyte of data. And you know, organizing and dealing with a couple of terabytes of data is something that's within the wheelhouse of most developers and groups. But once you're getting up to the petabyte level, you're really pushing into big data territory. And that's not something that most projects have the technical capabilities to really deal with and work with effectively. So there's this real problem if we apply a brute force approach that we are going to result in these significant data mortgages. So the next slide. A message that came out of the groups is that everyone really recognized this and that there was a need to try to find ways to prevent data mortgages. So two ways that the groups kind of approached this was one you could think about from the hardware side and the other from the software side. So from the hardware side, one is to really further the development of instruments that really are capable of intrinsically producing information. And I distinguish information as something you can do something with rather than data, which requires further processing to actually extract useful information. So an example of this would be the recording and transponding tags that can currently be attached to marine animals, and the idea of trying to extend both the duration of those tags while driving down their cost and their weight to make them more useful around marine energy sites. The problem right now is they tend to be expensive to deploy in large numbers, and they're difficult to attach. So that's a kind of a hardware development route where the hardware itself is intrinsically producing less data per unit of useful information. The other approach, obviously, is for automated processing on the software side that can mine data for information in near real time. And an example of this would be the ability to process split beam echo sounder data in near real time to track targets. Now, the idea here is that if you're going to engage in this kind of data mining, it's not enough to simply be able to mine the data in real time. To get away from the data mortgage problem, you would need the ability to basically trash the data that does not contain information of interest. Otherwise, you're ending up with the same sort of archival and curation problem for the data. In some cases, that's going to be acceptable to regulators. In other cases, it may not. And there's a number of examples of instruments that automatically are doing some degree of pre-processing. We already discard some degree of the data collected in any instrument. It's a question of how far we go towards basically discarding data in favor of information. And while all the groups pointed out that software had a real benefit here, I would argue that it's probably not reasonable to expect that there's going to be a silver bullet processing solution for all instruments, especially when we start moving into more of the near optical instruments where we're trying to not just detect an object in a frame of imagery, but try to actually classify and identify it. So there's certainly a lot of work going on in that area, but it's ongoing and it's certainly imperfect. So if we go to the next slide, one potential solution to this that was highlighted by a number of groups was integrated instrumentation packages as an intermediate solution between pure hardware and pure software options. And Andrea's already touched on this a little bit, but let me walk through an example here, which would involve detection, tracking, and identification of a marine mammal approaching a marine energy converter. So let's say that this marine mammal is actually vocal, and so we have a passive acoustic detection, which is acting as a first layer in the system. And that's processing acoustic information in near real time, and it's going to be operating in an omnidirectional manner with a range out to about 1 kilometer. Now, as that animal vocalizes and it gets closer, we have some degree to actually localize the vocal. And at that point, maybe the passive acoustic system hands things over to a split beam echo sounder, or another such instrument that's able to really track an animal in near real time at a range, say out to 100 meters and then in closer. So that's an instrument that's producing data, and if we're talking about basically analyzing that in real time to the extent that we're discarding the data and just taking the tracking information, we again avoid a data mortgage. And then once the animal is actually close enough to the system to be within range of something like a high bandwidth optical camera or acoustical camera, the split beam echo sounder or other tracking instrument could basically hand off to an identification instrument, which is just acquiring images over a short range and a limited field of view at high bandwidth, with the full knowledge that this sort of instrument is going to require some degree of archival processing to really extract that information. But we're operating those instruments in a way that they are only collecting data and you're only archiving data when there's a high probability of something being within the field of view, rather than running on a random duty cycle or operating continuously. And this sort of integrated package was something that almost every group came away, basically hinted towards in terms of thinking about that a single instrument or a single class of instruments was unlikely to provide all the needs for trying to answer some of these high priority questions. So if we go to the next slide, another common theme that emerged was with respect to instrumentation deployment. The participants uniformly felt that survivability and reliability of instrumentation was too low. And there were oftentimes greater concerns with the infrastructure required to support the instruments than the instruments themselves. So we can think about that, as a number of you have commented on the online comments here, the idea of, okay, well, can you put a camera or an active sonar, an AUV, and let it loose within a high energy wave or tidal site? What's the possibility of that AUV actually surviving? Well, the camera is probably okay, but if you can't actually move it around, that doesn't really help you very much. Similarly, the concern is with any sort of a power or export cable within these sites. And so the groups basically highlighted two aspects. For near field observations, integrating the instruments with the marine energy converters was felt to be a good option. It would be able to make use of the power and data capabilities of the marine converter itself that are in its export cable. And they also highlighted the need to potentially develop a standardized quote-unquote science port that would reduce integration cost, where if the community was able to agree on an interface for instrumentation with marine converters, it would allow scientists to do better planning to deploy these instruments. It would also allow developers to have a better feel for what scientists might ask of them in terms of the cost of integration. It basically takes the cost of integration from being something of an unknown custom or bespoke operation into something that's a much more easily understood cost from an engineering standpoint. And that helps to really to foster and facilitate collaboration. Now, for distribution and use, the general feeling was that if we're going to do a better job of distribution and use, we're going to need better autonomous platforms. And that can be, we can argue that an animal itself is an autonomous platform if we're using a tag, or we can talk about things like AUVs, whether they're drifters or propulsed. So if we go on to the next slide, the final synthesis point was collaboration. Everyone at the workshop felt that greater collaboration between research and industry is needed. And we say industry, we're not just talking about the developers of the mechs themselves. Obviously, interface there is helpful to address their objectives and study needs as an industry, but also to work with them on an engineering standpoint for the integration of instrumentation with the converters. But there's also a need to work with the instrumentation developers to get a better feel for packages that can be integrated and automatically processed. Then, throughout there was a feeling that greater collaboration with regulatory agencies would be required to help to understand the potential limitations of monitoring data to inform risk discussions, and to really start to flesh out a framework of really how we get to one of these two risk end states of saying, yes, something is a risk, or no, it's not, and we should move on to other areas. So these synthesis points were things that really every group hit on elements of these, and one thing Andrea and I really tried to do over the last couple of weeks is try to pull these together into something that actually would be an overall synthesis of really the outcomes of the workshop. So at that point, I think it's time to turn things back over to Andrea, where she can discuss some of the near-term recommendations coming out of the workshop.
All righty, thank you, Brian. Just to kind of wrap things up here, do we have the next slide that says near-term recommendations up?
Yep, standardize and collaborate.
Thank you. Okay, so through this whole workshop and the follow-up, as Brian mentioned afterwards, pulling this report together, what we saw was in the short term, the two words that just stood out consistently were standardize and collaborate. First, the real need for better standardization, although that may be too strong a word at this point, but perhaps best practices for environmental monitoring. How do we start to develop not only a series of instruments, but a methodology to use them to produce information that really informs environmental risk? And for some areas, such as the measuring sound from marine energy converters, we may be ready for international standards. So in a strong sense, we need to examine both these best practices and standards. There was, as one always hears with a group of scientists, and I think it's very real, we do need more funding for instrument development, for algorithm development, to work on deployment strategies, and the international scientific collaboration. We only had 2 days with this really great group of experts, but a great deal gets done when these people get in a room or even on the phone together, and there really needs to be ways to foster that. And not surprisingly, by the end of this workshop, where I think most people were pretty jazzed from the evaluations we got back, there's really a need to continue this dialogue, to have another workshop, to have an international conference. Now, happily, the plans for Annex 4 very much follow along these lines, and there is actually an international conference coming up in Scotland in April, the EIMR 2014 conference, eimr.org, I think it is. Anyway, we'll post that on our link so that you can get to that. But I would encourage anyone on the phone with a real interest who can get to Scotland. This will be a really good event. We will also hold an Annex 4 sponsored workshop to really continue this look at best practices. Next slide, please. In terms of overall conclusions for the workshop, we noted that most of the instrument gaps are not specific to wave or tidal technologies. There are some nuances that separate them, but really most of the work we could do in advancing instrumentation and software development will serve the entire marine renewable energy industry. As you've heard over and over, pre- and post-processing of data streams is a really high priority. Working on species-specific algorithms, really works the software side along with the hardware side, very important. Instrumentation, survivability, and deployment, very, very important. And it was noted over and over that many of the challenges for deploying, operating, and recovering instruments really mirror those challenges that deploying, operating, and recovering the marine energy devices themselves face. And finally, again, as you heard repeatedly, instruments really ought to be integrated into packages. We are going to meet the marine renewable energies industry's environmental obligations in a cost-effective manner only by bringing all these threads together and finding effective ways to integrate those needs. Last slide, please. That brings us to the end here. We have a great many people to acknowledge. We had some really talented breakout chair sessions, including Rob Surinam, Sharon Kramer, Hoyt Batty, Jocelyn Brown-Saraceno. We had lots of assistance from a lot of other people, including instrumentation manufacturers, agency, regulatory agency personnel, etc. We had a very talented team of University of Washington students who took notes throughout this frenzy of scientists talking and really helped us pull something coherent out of it. We also had wonderful logistic help from both University of Washington and PNNL staff. We are very grateful for the support from the Department of Energy Wind and Water Power Technologies Office. And what you see on the left there is an image of the cover of the report. The report is now available. The two links down below, it's got the same report on it, so either one, both on the University of Washington Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center site or on PNNL's TESIS site, you can find that there. And with that, I guess I want to give it back to Luke and see if we can answer some questions. And again, my vast apologies for some of the technical glitches.
Yes,
thank
you to both of you, Andrea and Brian. That was great. So I guess for a few questions, we have a few, and they seem to be still kind of trickling in. So let's start the question and answer round. Is it possible to create a list or database of interested parties and their specialty along with their level of interest and collaboration to help pool resources and spread costs over multiple projects?
Luke, I'll take the first cut at the first part of that, if you'd like. This is Andrea. We think that having this list of capabilities and people associated with them is really important. If you go to the TESIS link that Jocelyn gave you in the beginning, you will find there is a tab called Connections, and it has a list of researchers, institutions, and their focus within this measuring environmental effects for this industry. It is far from complete, but we are looking to increase that tremendously, and we're very open to ideas about other kinds of linkages as far as instruments and so on. So please take a look at that. As far as I think the rest of the question kind of got at the idea of a pooled instrument capability, and we think that's a really good idea too, and there's been discussion certainly in the U.S. and abroad over the last little while about that. There are some logistic challenges to that, but there could be some real value, particularly with high-end research instrumentation to be able to share. Brian, do you want to add to that?
No, Andrew, I think that does a great job of summarizing anything I would have said.
And Andrea, would it be possible to add to that list that you mentioned?
Absolutely. Thank you, Luke. One of the things that we are doing, and we are relaunching TESIS just with a new look and some new capabilities, and one of the things we're asking people to do is sign up for user accounts. And among other things on that sign up, it will allow you to say whether you would like to post your information to the list with your capabilities. It'll be sort of the kind of user profile many of us are used to on either social media or, big shopping sites online. And that will help us add to that list. We will also accept any kinds of suggestions from others. I would note that anything that gets posted on TESIS is facilitated. There's someone looking over it. We don't just post anything sent to us. But absolutely, we'd like to have any kind of input like that.
Great, thank you. So the next question. We are trying to measure acoustic outputs in very noisy environments. Presumably, this is through concern of concern for animals' welfare. Can we do the sums backwards and work out the capability we need of measuring devices to detect acoustic outputs that would be of concern?
Brian, do you want to take the first swag at that one?
Sure. So Ian, that's a good question. It was not something that we discussed heavily at the workshop. We thought about this. If you go through the workshop report, there's quite a bit in there in terms of what we thought was reasonable accuracy for different acoustic instruments. But because we were focused more on the question of what the capabilities were and the measurement of sound from the converters, and the animal welfare concerns really vary by site and location, we focused more on what we thought we could realistically achieve. And there's some discussion in the workshop report about really kind of what our certainty is on acoustic measurements versus some of those regulations. So for example, the general feeling was that for converter sound, if it's dominated by low frequencies, our accuracy probably isn't much better than plus or minus 10 dB, but at least in the US, there's an extraordinarily bright line between 119 dB broadband and 121 dB broadband. It's a difference between harassment and not harassment. And that we felt was really beyond our scope. We felt that what we could do is, within the context of the workshop, was to point out the capabilities and to think how we might be able to basically reduce that uncertainty bound. But it's a real challenge. I think that until we get a better feel on what exactly the acoustic output from the converters are and have a much better feeling of the uncertainty around those measurements, it's going to be difficult to do that reverse sum. But I think it does make sense to try to work at it the other way if it is possible.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Is someone able to publish a list of feasible budgets to allow engineers to build to cost? This could be especially important for automated processing, which may be costly, but could be feasible if shown much cheaper than manual analysis.
This is Andrea. It's a great question or a great goal to try to get to, and I think this is something that both when Jocelyn mentioned that the Department of Energy is planning on putting out a request for proposals, and also the workshop we'll hold in April in Scotland, we're going to try to start to think about what costs, what are reasonable costs to try to approach this kind of monitoring, and that has to include data processing. I don't think we have nearly as much information as we need to even effectively scope what that ideal system or data processing process would look like. But I think we're thinking about it and trying to get closer. And part of what the Department of Energy, and I know there's an EU request for proposals out right now too, to try to get at some of these instrumentation and processing needs. I think that's really the goal we're trying to work towards, to have some kind of a very defined set of not only what needs to be done but what it ought to cost. But I think we're still a little ways from it. Brian?
I was going to say the other thing is that the general consensus within the group seems to be that the closer we can get to a standardized approach to doing some of this monitoring, the closer we're going to be able to have commercial off-the-shelf solutions rather than customized solutions, and that will certainly help to drive down cost. Obviously, the objective is to get these costs to the point where we're still providing the data that we need for risk discussions, but we're not having quite as high a proportion of project costs devoted to monitoring going forward.
Right. Automation has got to help.
Yeah. And just to clarify, where does the 119 to 121 decibel threshold come from?
So that's a NIMS regulation that's currently under revision. That's basically 120 dB broadband is the threshold for basically acoustic disturbance.
Great.
This is a U.S. regulatory level, and those in the NOAA fisheries or NIMS that need to enforce that are aware that there was the need to create a certain line in order to do regulatory enforcement. However, the reason that these regulations are under review and people are looking at it is because we do not know enough to know whether that truly is the most important level, but it does really kind of make things difficult when we have these very wide error bars on measuring these devices, as Brian mentioned.
Great. Regarding the participation in the workshop, did anybody with field experience from Hawaii, particularly OPT, with OPT or EMEC, participate in the workshop?
We definitely had a number of people with lots of experience at EMEC. Did we have anybody who had actually worked in Hawaii, Brian?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the challenges of the workshop was that its timing in June conflicted with a number of people's field seasons, and so there were a number of people that were invited that were unable to attend, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, great. That was the last question that I had. So would anybody else like to ask any other questions?
Luke, there was a question about is a recording of the session going to be available along with the slides?
Yeah, so I was just going to add, I have one last slide after this. We will be posting a video and an audio of this webinar on the TETHIS site at that URL right there. It's basically under the broadcast tab on the top, and so hopefully in the next couple of days that will be posted. And then also, like I mentioned in the beginning, this is a quarterly webinar series, so we will be hosting another webinar hopefully in late March or early April.
And we will have all the technical glitches fixed by then.
Oh, don't make promises like that.
If that URL you're seeing right now, if you just go to the first part of it, the tethys.pnnl.gov, you will be able to see that connections tab at the top I mentioned, and the listing of experts is actually under institutions. It's listed by the home institution first and then the researcher. We may be revamping that, but that gives you a little tiny snapshot of some of the researchers who are really active in this field.
Right. Well, great. I guess if nobody else has any other questions, I think that wraps it up. Thanks, everyone, for participating and getting on the webinar today and struggling through our initial technical difficulties. And hopefully we'll have these all figured out next time.